World War II stands as the most catastrophic conflict in human history, surpassing its predecessor in terms of the staggering number of casualties. To comprehend the immense loss of life between the two world wars, it is crucial to examine the geographical locations where the battles unfolded. World War I, often referred to as Europe's Great War, involved the major European powers along with their colonies, dragged into the conflict through the lens of colonialism. While the fighting extended beyond Europe, the costliest battles predominantly occurred on the European continent. It was a brutal affair, with British soldiers facing an approximately 11% chance of never returning home. However, the intensity of the fighting was geographically limited. The onset of World War II witnessed a more interconnected world than ever before. Consequently, the conflict had to be more global in nature. Defeating European powers no longer guaranteed containment within Europe alone. While a significant portion of the fighting still transpired on the continent, Africa also became a theater of war as the Axis powers aimed to sever Allied access to Middle Eastern and African oil. Today, the remnants of massive battles in northern Africa, where tanks clashed, serve as a testament to these events. Moreover, the involvement of Japan added a new dimension to the war. Japan's aspiration to dominate the Pacific brought it into direct conflict with the European powers who possessed lucrative colonies in the region. These colonies provided vital resources such as food, rubber, and, once again, oil, which Japan desperately required. As an island nation, Japan faced resource scarcity and heavily relied on imports. This vulnerability allowed Western powers to exert control over Japan by threatening trade embargoes, limiting its potential as a major global power. The outbreak of hostilities in Europe presented Japan with an opportunity to seize these valuable colonies, expel Western influences from the Pacific, and establish its own empire. China, which had been embroiled in internal strife between nationalists and communists, had already experienced Japanese aggression. Despite its size advantage over Japan, China had been weakened and exploited by European powers for a century, rendering it unable to resist the Imperial Japanese forces effectively. China's resources and industrial capacity were crucial to Japan's ambitions, but the United States stood as the one Western power capable of undermining Japan's grand design. The United States had long maintained a strong presence in the Pacific to safeguard its trade interests. Despite being a vast country, the United States relied on maritime power due to its strategic position between the Atlantic and Pacific. Consequently, the nation was committed to preventing any major power, be it European or Asian, from encroaching upon its hemisphere. By the time World War II erupted, the United States Navy rivaled the esteemed Royal Navy, serving the purpose of keeping conflicts far from American shores. Much of this naval power was stationed in the Pacific, where the United States vigilantly monitored Japan. Japanese expansionism had significantly disrupted U.S. trade in the region, leading to strained relations. With its forces protecting vital rubber plantations and oil fields, the United States held a superior strategic position. Additionally, Japan heavily depended on American oil and industrial exports, ensuring that the United States retained significant leverage over Japan. Consequently, in December 1941, the Imperial Japanese Navy launched a devastating attack on Pearl Harbor, aiming to cripple the U.S. Navy and eliminate its presence in the Pacific. Simultaneously, Japan invaded the American-held Philippines, seeking to eliminate any potential base of operations for counterattacks. This expanded the scope of the war, transforming it into the first truly global conflict, with battles raging across the entire planet. In the Pacific theater alone, an estimated 25 million casualties occurred, surpassing the total casualties of World War I. Shockingly, out of these casualties, only 6 million were combatants, while a staggering 19 million were civilians. While both sides targeted civilians, the Japanese Empire engaged in ruthless acts of violence against Chinese civilians, reminiscent of contemporary events in Ukraine. The majority of civilian casualties were Chinese, with an estimated 7 to 8 million lives lost due to mass killings, indiscriminate bombings, and the ravages of war itself. In the city of Nanjing alone, approximately 200,000 Chinese civilians were killed within 6 weeks as the Japanese army unleashed unparalleled brutality. The addition of a new theater of war significantly escalated the overall casualties of World War II. Technological advancements also played a role, turning the conflict into the bloodiest in human history. At the outset of World War I, airplanes were merely considered reconnaissance tools. However, their potential as weapons became evident as machine guns were mounted on them. Aerial bombardment emerged as a strategy to inflict mass casualties. While the initial aerial bombardments involved crude weapons such as sharpened darts, they were largely inaccurate. The advent of more powerful engines enabled airplanes to carry larger payloads, leading to devastating bombings that caused deep, wide wounds that were impossible to stop bleeding. However, most of the sharpened darts failed to hit their targets, serving as little more than hazards for soldiers on the ground. Grenades were soon being thrown out of the exposed cockpits of airplanes, but engineers had grander visions. They dreamed of larger aircraft capable of carrying significantly more bombs, enough to make a substantial impact on enemy units. Initially, the first bombers could only transport between 55 and 120 pounds of bombs. However, advancements in aircraft technology led to the development of planes like the Russian Ilyushin, which could carry up to 1,500 pounds of bombs. It was evident that airplanes would become the most crucial weapons of the impending World War. When World War II erupted, Hitler's armies effectively utilized fighter and bomber aircraft as part of their blitzkrieg tactics, commonly known as lightning warfare. By bombarding enemy defenses from the air before ground forces arrived, they weakened the opposition for subsequent ground attacks. In the Pacific, Imperial Japan demonstrated that the era of battleships was coming to an end when it nearly defeated the United States in a single strike, deploying aircraft launched from carriers. Airplanes enabled the transportation of massive bomb loads over hundreds, or even thousands, of miles. With multiple planes, entire cities could be besieged. Presently, modern warfare dictates engaging enemy troops and targeting military and economically significant assets, while sparing civilian populations. Deliberately targeting civilians as part of a strategy to defeat the enemy is no longer acceptable. However, during World War II, the mass slaughter of civilians was a strategic approach. By eradicating a civilian population, the economic consequences would make it difficult or impossible for the enemy to sustain the war effort. Moreover, mass killings demoralized the enemy, often prompting nations to seek peace. Thus, in World War II, targeting cities was not only deemed permissible but also pivotal to achieving success. In World War I, civilian deaths numbered around 10 million. In contrast, civilian deaths in World War II were twice as high as military deaths, estimated at approximately 50 to 55 million. The airplane played a significant role in facilitating much of this devastation. During World War I, artillery was the primary means of threatening an enemy, with a range typically limited to a few miles. Since most combat took place outside populated areas, civilian casualties resulting directly from combat were relatively low, with many deaths attributed to war-related consequences such as starvation and disease. However, in World War II, airplanes could pose a threat to cities across entire nations, if not further. They could carry thousands of pounds of bombs, and with bomber formations sometimes consisting of hundreds of planes, indiscriminate bombing campaigns could level entire cities. The use of specialized bombs further increased the efficiency of killing. Incendiary munitions or bombs designed to create massive firestorms, rather than cause extensive blast damage, were often employed against targeted cities. The British Royal Air Force's bombing of the German city of Dresden serves as an example, reducing it to a concrete skeleton covered in ash within 3 days. Approximately 3,900 tons of high explosives and incendiary devices were dropped on the city, causing unprecedented destruction, which would have shaken commanders on both sides in World War I. However, in World War II, the death of 25,000 civilians in just 3 days became tragically commonplace. In the Pacific Theater, air raids on civilian cities reached catastrophic heights. While more civilians perished in Europe, Japanese civilians were exceptionally vulnerable to air raids during the strategic bombing campaign that began in 1944. With Japan refusing to surrender, the Allies devised plans to invade the Japanese islands. To weaken Japan for the impending invasion and attempt to compel surrender, unrestricted bombing of Japanese islands was authorized. Initially, air raids targeted military and industrial installations, decimating major Japanese industrial centers. As Japanese forces suffered from fuel and resource shortages, coupled with a lack of trained pilots and planes, they could mount little resistance against the air raids. Anti-aircraft guns on the ground were largely ineffective against high-flying American B-29s. Consequently, the Japanese dispersed their industrial efforts, relocating them to homes and small workshops across cities. This decentralized structure made them harder to target and neutralize, prompting the approval of mass bombing campaigns against the civilian population. Japanese cities were not only ill-prepared for aerial attacks but also highly susceptible to bombing. The United States swiftly realized that conventional high explosives were ineffective against Japanese cities due to their predominant use of wood in construction. High explosive bombs were designed to destroy European cities made of brick and mortar, while Japanese cities were more vulnerable to incendiary devices. Consequently, US bombers began dropping thousands of incendiary devices over Japanese cities, igniting massive firestorms that razed entire urban areas. The extensive destruction of Japanese cities and loss of life were not solely due to the sheer volume of bombings carried out by the US but also the inadequate organization of civil defense. Japan had not developed a substantial number of bomb shelters, and it was unlikely that they anticipated the same level of devastating bombing they were inflicting on Chinese cities. Consequently, civilians had no refuge from the flames that engulfed entire cities, resulting in their incineration on the streets. Additionally, Japanese firefighters were ill-equipped and poorly trained to combat the raging infernos, allowing fires to spiral out of control without hope of containment. While the world may remember the atomic bombs dropped on Nagasaki and Hiroshima, the scale of aerial campaigns far surpassed the atomic bombings. When Imperial Japanese Command learned of the total casualties caused by the bombings, they were largely unfazed, having already endured far worse. The realization that a single bomb could cause such devastation was the only factor that gave them pause. Furthermore, the development of mobile warfare on the ground contributed to the staggering casualties of World War II. In the pre-war era, troops predominantly moved on foot, limiting the speed and scope of advances. Mechanization revolutionized warfare by combining tanks and mechanized infantry, enabling faster movement and broader coverage. As a result, more territory could be covered, expanding the scope of the fighting and placing a larger civilian population at risk. Nowhere was the impact of mobile warfare more pronounced than on the Eastern Front. In World War I, Russia was defeated relatively early, and Germany did not require an invasion to force its exit from the war. The violence in that conflict resulted in an estimated 8 to 10 million deaths, along with a greater number of wounded. However, during World War II, the Eastern Front witnessed a staggering death toll of approximately 40 million, about 4 times higher than in World War I. The invasion of Russia opened an entirely new front in the war, which had been limited in the previous conflict. Hitler's brutal campaign towards Moscow exacerbated the casualties and devastation experienced on the Eastern Front. During World War II, one of the most deadly theaters of the conflict was the Eastern Front, where staggering casualties were incurred. However, Adolf Hitler, the orchestrator of immense atrocities, was also busy inflating his numbers through the perpetration of one of the greatest crimes in human history. Hitler harbored a vision of a racially pure Europe, exclusively inhabited by the Aryan race, with a small token population of other races to serve as slave labor. To realize this grotesque fantasy, he instigated large-scale industrial slaughter targeting anyone he deemed undesirable. Merely belonging to a different race, holding an undesirable political ideology, or being disabled was sufficient to warrant inclusion on Hitler's hit list. The pursuit of a racially pure Third Reich left no room for individuals who did not meet the criteria of physical and mental perfection, leading to the mass extermination of people with special needs. Although the Holocaust encompasses numerous victims, the most well-known targets were the Jewish people, with an estimated 5 to 6 million of them falling victim to concentration camps and mass killings across Germany and occupied territories. As the German army expanded its dominion, systematic eradication of undesirables commenced, confining them to ghettos where they were isolated until transportation arrangements could be made to relocate them to either work camps as slave laborers or extermination camps. These cramped ghettos were enclosed by barbed wire, armed guards, and hastily constructed concrete barriers, effectively sealing off the inhabitants from the outside world. Scarce food supplies and the prevalence of disease led to mass starvation and the deaths of many individuals long before trucks and trains arrived for deportation. Often, populations were sorted either prior to boarding trains or shortly thereafter. Those deemed healthy or skilled enough were selected for labor camps, where they were forced to contribute to German industrial and military endeavors. The remaining individuals, whom the Nazis viewed as disposable possessions, were marked for extermination and promptly dispatched to their deaths. This grim fate frequently entailed ordering prisoners to undress and enter vast shower facilities, deceitfully presented as a measure to safeguard their health. However, once inside, the doors were locked and all ventilation sealed, enabling the release of lethal gas into the chamber. The victims endured agonizing deaths by asphyxiation, a process that could last up to 15 minutes. Some even survived the initial ordeal, only to meet their end at the hands of Nazi guards, who shot them to death after being buried alive by piles of corpses. Although Jews endured the greatest suffering at the hands of the Nazi extermination efforts, they were not the only population subjected to mass killings. As the Nazi armies advanced into the Soviet Union, Hitler aimed to completely annihilate the indigenous population, transforming Russia into a vast, pure German colony. To fulfill this objective, a staggering 5.7 million Soviet civilians were condemned to death, often through mass shootings where victims were lined up and mercilessly gunned down. Enormous pits were dug, and rows of Soviet prisoners were methodically executed, falling into the pits as machine guns tore through their ranks. The cycle would repeat with each new row until the pit was nearly full, at which point it would be covered with soil. Soviet prisoners of war, POWs, also became victims, despite the rules of war mandating their humane treatment. While Western POWs received relatively fair treatment, German forces engaged in widespread slaughter of captured Soviet soldiers. An estimated 2.8 to 3.3 million Soviet POWs lost their lives during the German invasion. Poland, which bore the initial brunt of Germany's aggression, suffered the deaths of up to 3 million of its citizens. Additionally, approximately 600,000 Serbs, 500,000 Romani, 25,000 Slovenes, and 3,500 Spanish Republicans fighting against Hitler were mercilessly exterminated. Hitler's campaign to eliminate undesirables extended to the disabled population within Germany and occupied territories. Roughly 270,000 disabled individuals fell victim to the Nazis. Political and religious affiliations were also grounds for extermination, resulting in the deaths of as many as 200,000 Freemasons and up to 5,000 Jehovah's Witnesses. Homosexuals in Germany and conquered territories were targeted as well, with an estimated death toll of 25,000. The wholesale slaughter of entire populations stands as a significant factor in making World War II deadlier than its predecessor. For the first time in history, mass murder was industrialized, and had the war persisted, the casualty numbers would have been astronomically higher. Ironically, Germany's later struggles in the war hindered further atrocities. As resources dwindled, the transportation of hundreds of thousands of potential victims to extermination camps became untenable, and the demands of actual warfare spared many from the clutches of the Nazis.